Welcome back to Math Workshop. We've been working on different ways to compare fractions. We've done comparing fractions using common features, and we've done comparing fractions, comparing them to the benchmarks of a half or one whole. So I wanted to remind you of that as we get ready to start this lesson, which is the last lesson in topic 1, where you're going to need to implement both of those skills in order to compare several fractions at one time. But I thought this was a good warm-up. Anne says that 3/10 is less than 6/8. Tarek says that 3/10 is greater than 6/8. Who's right? Take a minute, pause the video if you want, and try to decide the answer to that. So I hope you took a minute and tried this, and you looked at 3/10 and you realized that 3/10 is less than half, because half of 3/10, one half would be 5/10 if we're talking about the denominator 10. So 3/10 is less than half. If we think about dividing something into eighths, half would be 4/8. So 6/8 is greater than half. So if 6/8 is greater than half and 3/10 is less than half, then Anne has to be correct. She says that 3/10 is less than 6/8. And it's those reasoning skills that we're going to use today in order to put fractions in order without really having to do any calculations, just thinking about it. So on the next screen, this screen, I wrote down those two strategies. To compare fraction, we use common features. You'll remember we did common denominators. You'll remember we did common numerators. And then we compared to the benchmarks in the last lesson of a half and one. In the example you saw here, Math 180 does a whole lot of writing things out symbolically. I find this to be confusing. So instead of going that route and writing out what's greater than and less than and using all those symbols, I simply like to use a number line. And I like to put 0 on my number line. I like to put a half on my number line. And I like to put 1 on my number line. And then I go through and I look at what's given and try to get those in order. So you'll remember that the theme for Block 5 is about medicine and healthcare professions. So we have a problem here about donating blood. 5 people donated blood. They gave 3/10 of a pint, 5/4 of a pint, 3/8 of a pint, 11/16 of a pint, and 9/16 of a pint. Put the amounts in order from least to greatest, from smallest to largest. Well, the first thing I notice is this fraction. 5/4 is an improper fraction. The numerator is larger than the denominator. So what I know about 5/4 is I know that it's greater than 1. So up here above 1, I'm going to put 5/4 on my number line. Okay, so we've used that one. Now, I look at the rest, and I've got common numerators for 3/8 and 3/10, and I've got common denominators for 11/16 and 9/16. I'm going to start with those common denominators. If I think about 11/16 and 9/16, and I think about half, when you think about half and 16ths, 16 divided by 2 is 8. Both of these are greater than half. But because they have common denominators, I know that 9/16 would come before 11/16. They're both somewhere between a half and 1, but they are 9 is smaller than 11. So I know I can get those in order. So now that leaves me with the eighths, with the tenths and the eighths. So I've got 3/10 and I've got 3/8. And those both have the same numerator. With a common numerator like that, remember, we think about the denominator. And so I'm thinking about the size of the piece. If I had a cake and I cut it into 10 pieces, and if I cut that same size cake into 8 pieces, the 8s would be larger. I'd have bigger pieces. So I've got, with 3/10, I've got 3 little pieces. With 3/8, I've got 3 bigger pieces. So 3/10 is less than 3/8. So now if I go back and I try to get these 5 fractions in order, 3/10 has to be the littlest because tenths are smaller than eighths, and both 3/10 and 3/8 are less than half. 9/16 is less than 11/16. They're both greater than half, so they're both bigger than 3/10 or 3/8, but 9 is less than 11, and since they're both the same size piece, they're both 16ths, 9 would come before 11. And then finally 5/4, because 5/4 is greater than 1. It's that improper fraction with a numerator greater than a denominator. Here's another example. Emergency responders could be anything from an EMT to the fire department to a police officer, but emergency responders record the distances traveled for each incident. The distances are 2/10 of a mile, 5/6 of a mile, 5/4 of a mile, 5/8 of a mile, and 2/5 of a mile. Put the amounts in order from least to greatest. So let's start with that number line. Let's get 0 on it, get a half, and then get 1 whole. And take a few minutes and pause the video and put those in order the way you think they should be. Since I can't check your work, it's really important to me that you try it and then we go over it in just a second. So pause and work these, put these 5 fractions in order, and then come back. So I hope you have your answers in order. Let me go through how I would think this through and see if we match up. So I zoned in again on 5/4 being an improper fraction. The numerator is larger than the denominator, and I put it up here higher than 1. I don't notice any of my other fractions being higher than 1. So now if we take a look, we've got tenths. 2/10 would be less than half, so it's going to come down here somewhere. 5/6 is more than half because half would be 3/6, since 3 is half of 6. So that's going to come up here somewhere. And then we've got 5/8 and 2/5 to put on here. So 5/8, 4/8 would be half. 5/8 is more than half. So now I have to think about the 5/8 and the 5/6. Would the 5/8 go between a half and 5/6, or would 5/8 be greater than 5/6? And I go back to think about the size of the piece. An 1/8 is smaller than a 1/6. So if I have 5 smaller pieces, 5/8 has to be smaller than 5/6. Now we're down to 2/5. Half of 5 is 2.5, which is weird to equal a half. We don't normally have a decimal in a fraction, but it's possible. And so 2/5 is just a little bit less than half. Just a teeny tiny bit. But I also can compare these because of the numerators being the same. If I had a cake cut into 10 pieces, they would be smaller than a cake cut into 5 pieces. So 2/10 has to be smaller than 2/5. So in order, these go 2/10, 2/5, 1/2, 5/8. Wait a minute. Don't use the half. This should be the 5/8. I can't get to my eraser. I apologize. This should be 5/6, and this should be 5/4. So we have them in order from least to greatest. Now sometimes you have to put mixed numbers in order. So let's think if we had 6 3/8, 6 5/6, 7 1/4, and 7 and, oops, I can't erase, 7 1 1/8. And we wanted to put those in order. So when you get ready to do your number line and you're using these improper fractions, we're not going to put 0 and 1 on it because that's way too low. We've got 6s and 7s. We should know that all of these are going to come between 6 and 7. Oh, some of them are higher than 7, so we should extend this a little longer. And then I'd put 6.5 in here, thinking about that. So 6 3/8 would be less than 6.5 because 4/8 is half. So 6 3/8 would come down here. 6 5/6, 3/6 is half. So 5/6 is more than half. So we'd have 6 5/6. The next two are both above 7. So we've got these two to go. And we'd stop and think, which is smaller, which is going to give us that smaller piece, a 1/4 or an 1/8. Well, taking one whole and cutting it into 8ths is going to give us a smaller piece than cutting it into 4ths. So now we've got all of these in order. 6 3/8 would be smaller than 6 5/6, which is less than 7 1/8, which is less than 7 1/4. And that's ugly too. Hey, just like school, I have no control over the pen sometimes. Hey, remember please that there is a quiz for you to do to practice these skills. Some of them will be word problems like we practiced, and some of the problems are just practicing the skills that we used. So make sure that you do that. Make sure that you use a name that I recognize, please. And I hope you have a great weekend. Today's Friday, even though all the days seem the same. I don't know if you're having that trouble or not. Take care. Let me know if you need any help. Bye.